Hello everyone, I'm Coach Tickety, and today we're going to be talking about how to counter every single tank in Overwatch 2. It's no secret that ever since the move from 6v6 to 5v5 in Overwatch 2, tanks have been a pretty important role, and countering them can sometimes mean the difference between winning or losing your games. So we're going to break down every tank, talk about their preferred playstyles and what you can do against them, as well as offer some potential counter picks for every role in the game, so whether you're a DPS, tank, or support player, we'll have something here to recommend for you. If you like this type of content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know down in the comments who is your least favorite tank to go up against. Who do you find just the hardest to play against in Overwatch 2 right now? And if you're looking for more ways to improve at the game, then you should head over to GameLeap.com. Whether you're looking for detailed guides about a specific topic or in-depth hero courses about your main, you will find exactly what you're looking for over on our website. Seriously guys, there are hundreds of videos on the website right now, and there's more being added every single week, so I highly recommend you check out that link below the video or just head over to GameLeap.com and get your membership started today. Alright, now let's jump in with our tanks, starting with D.Va. D.Va is a defensive powerhouse, not because she can stand still for a long time and soak a bunch of pressure, but because of the flexibility of her mobility and her defense matrix. While she doesn't usually get as aggressive as some other mobile tanks in the roster, she can usually respond to almost any situation at the touch of a button. So when you're playing against D.Va, it's very important to be able to put up multiple sources of pressure at the same time. The idea here is that you want to force her boosters to commit in one direction while you're still putting up pressure somewhere else. This can take the form of maybe multiple sight lines that you're pressuring, or sometimes having high mobility and flankers in her backline. If you're playing tank against an enemy D.Va, I would recommend Zarya. Not because she can find any interesting points of pressure, but because D.Va can't do anything about Zarya's pressure in the front line. Her beam will just straight up go through D.Va's defense matrix. And of course, Zarya's bubbles are great at reacting to any situations where D.Va is trying to get aggressive, whether that's by boosting onto a target or even in response to her ultimate self-destruct. For DPS playing against D.Va, I would recommend Mei, because again, your beam will go through the matrix and you can use your wall to force D.Va to use boosters defensively, opening up a lot more space for your team. And of course, you've got your ice block to survive pressure and her ultimate to self-destruct again. And for supports playing against D.Va, I'd recommend Mercy, because there's nothing that D.Va can do to deny your beams, and you've got the mobility to escape any of her aggressive pressure. As well as enabling multiple threats in the form of your DPS with your damage boost is a great way to force D.Va out of position. Next on the tank line is DOOMFIST, and DOOMFIST is all about those aggressive dives and kill potential that he can pull off with all of his mobility cooldowns. When playing against DOOMFIST, you want to try and poke out his cooldowns from a safe distance, but do keep in mind that he can go a long way with all of his mobility. Just because he's far away doesn't always mean you're safe. Oh, and please don't shoot him while he's blocking, because that empowered punch makes him so much more lethal. For tanks playing into DOOMFIST, I would recommend Orisa, since you should be able to approach him very safely because you can simply fortify any of his aggression and walk away unscathed. You can also interrupt every single cooldown from DOOMFIST with your javelin throw if you can hit some nice shots. Just be careful about throwing it into him when he's using power block, since it almost does enough damage to fully charge his punch, so if he's taken any poke before that throw, he will get the empowered punch. For DPS here, I would recommend Tracer, since your mobility allows you to scout out DOOMFIST's positions if he's trying for a sneaky rollout or anything like that, and you can safely poke him out in close range since you can easily react to him charging a punch or using cooldowns with your blink timings. It's also not a bad idea to go for pulse bombs against DOOMFIST, since he is relatively squishy for a tank. It won't outright kill him every time, but if you can get a little bit of follow-up damage afterwards, it'll usually finish the job. And for supports, I'd recommend Ana into DOOMFIST, since you should be able to play a very safe range thanks to your weapon, and you can counter his dive attempts with either your nade or your sleep dart. And I would highly recommend using that sleep dart anytime he goes for that power block, since it'll not only cancel the block, it'll also make him very vulnerable to follow-up damage. Next tank on the list is Junker Queen, and honestly, she's barely a tank. She's more of a DPS with extra HP than anything else, so you want to make sure you're just playing at a safe range against her. You don't want to get too close, you don't want to get hit by her knife or her axe swings, and you want to make sure that you and your team aren't too grouped up for big carnage swings or of course for her ultimate rampage. For tanks, I would recommend RAMATTRA into Junker Queen, because you should be able to bully her out of the front line fairly easily, as well as split her from her team with your shield usage. And once you force Junker Queen to back up, there's really not much else she can do. For DPS, I would recommend Hanzo here, because you should be able to spam her out very easily from a very safe range, and any headshots you land against her will almost guarantee a forced shout usage, or at least force her to back up. You can also use your Sonic Arrow to scout Junker Queen's position anytime she's trying to hide around a corner for those big carnage swings. For supports, there's a pretty easy pick here against Junker Queen, and that's Kiriko. Cleanse versus anti-healing or even just big bleed damage is crucial for countering Junker Queen in this matchup, as well as headshots are being pretty easy to hit against Junker Queen in the front line, so you you don't need to put yourself at risk to do decent damage. Next up is Orisa, and Orisa is really just the tankiest tank who's ever tanked in Overwatch 2. You're not going to have a good time trying to go through her with all of her defensive cooldowns, so instead you should try going around or above her whenever possible. You should only try to outlast her cooldowns in the front line if your tank is just as tanky as her. So for tanks, I would recommend Wrecking Ball. You should be able to threaten her team very easily with all of your mobility and basically just ignore everything Orisa does. Even if she hits you with her Javelin as Wrecking Ball, you can usually just pack up your things and roll away. For DPS, I would recommend Echo here, because you not only have strong, consistent range damage with your primary fire and sticky bombs, you also have the mobility to easily take space above the Orisa whenever it suits you. And the execute on your focusing beam doesn't hurt either, because even during Fortify and Javelin Spin, you can do a good chunk of damage against Orisa whenever she's below 50% HP. For the support line, there aren't too many heroes that have a good time going up or around Orisa in the matchup, so instead I'm going to recommend Zenyatta, because the poke damage you can get off very simply from range and not be threatened by Orisa at all, and just applying Discord to Orisa herself makes her much squishier and can force her out of position when your team needs it. Next on the list is RAMATTRA, and to be honest, he's not a very easy tank to counter. He's kind of a jack of all trades, master of all. With a lot of his kit, he's got tools to react to a lot of different situations, but your best bet is to try and bait out his Nemesis form before trying to go all in. To do this, you can try and threaten multiple sightlines to deny value from things like his shield and his block while he's in Nemesis form. For tanks, you might try out DOOMFIST to try and threaten his backline instead of trying to deal with RAMATTRA and all his different cooldowns. Anytime RAMATTRA goes aggressive with his Nemesis form, you can instead split your pressure and go on his backline to prevent any follow-up from his team. But if the enemy team is playing stacked around RAMATTRA, Doom can also find good value there with big hits from his Seismic Slam, as well as punching RAMATTRA himself out of position to force him to play more defensively from that point on. For DPS, I'd recommend trying Pharah in the matchup, since it's very easy to threaten RAMATTRA from angles above him, and you'll be easily staying out of the range of his Vortex, since while it might have been designed to pull Pharahs and Echoes out of the air, realistically it doesn't reach that high vertically, and you should have no problem avoiding that cooldown. And your ultimate Barrage does so much damage it can even kill RAMATTRA through his block, which can be a strong counter to his ultimate Annihilation. And for supports, Lucio is going to be my go-to here, not because you can do much against RAMATTRA yourself, but because the speed boost allows your team to stay safely away from his range whenever he's in Nemesis form, and allow you to go all in on him when he doesn't have that cooldown available. Sound Barrier is also an excellent counter to Annihilation, since it'll allow your team to get aggressive and basically ignore all the damage coming in from that ultimate. Next up is REINHARDT, everyone's favorite rectangle man. Pretty straightforward kit here. He's a good frontliner with a strong defensive ability in his shield, but overall he's very limited by his short range and his grounded mobility, so whenever you're going up against him, you'll want to try and break his shield before he approaches and deny his aggression by playing angles that he can't contest, like on long sight lines or on high grounds. As a tank trying to counter REINHARDT, I would recommend RAMATTRA. You'll be able to poke him out as he approaches in your Omnic form, and when he gets too close, you'll be able to trade blows with him with your punches, since they will pierce through his shield and even damage any allies that are standing too close to him. Just make sure you're positioning safe enough to not get caught out by pins or shatter plays. For most DPS, you can simply outrange or play on high grounds against the REINHARDT like we mentioned, but for going toe-to-toe with him, I would recommend Bastion. Simply break out the turret form anytime he tries to approach with his shield up, and he will quickly be backing up and suddenly not be as aggressive. Just keep in mind that anytime you are playing Bastion, you become much weaker without that cooldown available, so you can't waste it too early. You need to make sure that REINHARDT's actually looking to commit to the fight before you try and poke him out. And for supports here, I'll recommend Baptiste, since his big AoE heals and his immortality field can help your team survive and stabilize after big hits from Rein's hammer, his pins, his shatters, his fire strikes, all these big AoE sources of damage that he puts out. Bap also has an easy time staying away from Rein thanks to his exo boots, and you could even get aggressive against him similar to Bastion by putting up the amp matrix anytime Rein tries to walk forward. Next on the list is ROADHOG, another big DPS disguised as a tank. And ROADHOG is pretty simple. He'll try to run around the map, maybe hit flank angles, and try to land big, important hooks that eventually lead to kills. You don't want to spend too much time addressing the ROADHOG, and actually you want to ignore him as much as possible. Do this by scouting him out whenever you can, and ping him to your teammates so that no one gets caught off guard by that hook. And once that cooldown's out of the way, ROADHOG's a lot easier to deal with, and he's a lot easier to bully. For tanks against ROADHOG, I would recommend Sigma, since you'll be able to poke him out from a safe range and block any of his hook or damage attempts with your shield, as well as interrupt his healing with your accretion. So much counterplay here. For DPS, I'll recommend Reaper here. Pretty straightforward matchup. Your shotguns will absolutely chew through through his health bar, and you can use your Wraith to outplay his hook. You can also use your teleport as a mobility tool to escape or ignore the Roadhog and go for his teammates instead. And for the support line, I'll recommend Ana as a counter. Again, pretty straightforward. The anti-healing effects as well as your sleep dart are very easy to hit against Roadhog, and they are huge counters to everything he wants to do. You can interrupt his cooldowns or deny a kill from him, as well as make him a vulnerable kill target for your team anytime you hit him with basically any of your cooldowns. You can also use Nano reactively anytime a squishy teammate gets hooked to not only save their life, but allow them to get aggressive instead. Next up is Sigma, and he's a very popular pick on a lot of long, linear maps with really long sightlines, thanks to the flexibility of his shield enabling those sightlines for his team, as well as shutting them down from enemies. Your best bets against Sigma are either to try and break through his shield before pushing into the front line, or trying to get around his shield and capitalizing on the fact that he has to take it down and reposition it anytime new threats pop up. For tanks here, I'll recommend REINHARDT. It should be fairly easy to walk up against Sigma, block all of his damage and his rock throws with your shield, and then do more damage once you're able to get up close. For ultimates, Rein Shield is great at blocking the follow-up damage from Sigma's Gravitic Flux. Even if your whole team gets caught in it, it's not going to matter if they can't do any damage afterwards, so your shield's great there. And it's really hard for Sigma to react to Rein's Earth Shatter, since you can just hold it until you see the enemy Sigma take down his shield, or sometimes just walk right past it. For DPS against Sigma, I'll recommend Cassidy. You should be able to stay safe at a decent range with Cassidy, and anytime there's a shield directly in front of you, you can burn it with your Fan the Hammer. Your ultimate High Noon is also a great counter to Sigma's Gravitic Flux, since he can't use any other defensive cooldowns while he's ulting, so you might be able to get a shot off on him for free, and you get the damage reduction and a new angle anytime he pulls you up into the air. And for supports, we'll recommend Zenyatta, because again, you've got very safe poke damage from a safe range, and it should be fairly easy to weave your discords in anytime Sigma drops his shield, which he does fairly frequently. And of course, your Transcendence is a great tool for countering Gravitic Flux, as long as you can jump in the circle and go up with your teammates. Next up is Winston, a very straightforward but very strong nonetheless dive tank. Winston's mobility isn't as creative as some of the other tanks, but his bubble is an extremely strong defensive tool, so whenever possible when you're playing against him, you want to try and poke him out before he jumps and hope for a defensive bubble use, which will limit his aggression later on. For tanks playing into Winston, I'd recommend ROADHOG. You should be able to simply blast him with your shotgun anytime you can get close enough, as well as very easily survive any damage opportunities with your self-heal. Both your hook and your ultimate whole hog are great at countering Winston's dive attempts. Even if he has primal available, this should negate a lot of his pressure. For DPS, we'll recommend Reaper here into Winston, because again, it's very safe to bully him with your shotguns anytime you can get close enough, as well as use your Wraith form to escape any pressure that their DPS might be putting up. Just try to remember not to be too predictable as Reaper, since the Winston's likely looking out for you and trying to avoid you at all costs. Think about using your teleport to reposition and mix up your location, or to use it aggressively and get on top of the Winston before he jumps to once again try and force him to use that bubble defensively. And for supports, I'll recommend Brigitte against Winston, since his damage really doesn't do that much against Briggs' Inspire. You should be very easily sustaining against Winston's dive attempts, and of course the displacement from your whip shot or your shield bash are great at interrupting those jump attempts, or just for knocking Winston out of his bubble. And the newly buffed Rally not only makes you much less diveable individually, but also makes it very easy for your team to survive very strong dive attempts even when ultimates are on the field for the enemy team. Next up is Wrecking Ball, and he is another dive tank, but he's a lot less predictable than some of the others, since he can basically come from any direction and look for his displacement or all-in dive attempts. Whenever you're playing against a Wrecking Ball, you should always be ready to be booped out of position off of a high ground into the open, things like that, and have key cooldowns ready to either counter those attempts or at the very least survive them. But keep in mind that once Wrecking Ball disengages, once he starts rolling away, he is going to be very hard to chase down, so don't waste your time trying to focus him for too long. For tanks, I'll recommend Junker Queen into Wrecking Ball, because you can easily threaten the rest of his team while he's setting up for his dive, since there basically is no tank on the enemy team until he engages. But when Wrecking Ball does go for the engage, you've got your commanding shout to keep your team healthy during his dive attempts, and you can even try and hit him with a knife throw to pull him back in as he starts rolling away to keep him around a little while longer. That might just be long enough to finish the kill. For DPS, I'll recommend Sombra here, because you can hack him and he dies. The end. You can go for these hack attempts either while the ball is setting up to interrupt his rollout and then get a bunch of free ult charge, or as he's engaging to make him vulnerable in the middle of your team when he thought he was getting a good dive off. And for supports here, I'll recommend Ana, because unlike Winston, Wrecking Ball doesn't have a bubble that can block important cooldowns, so you should have no problem landing a good anti-heal nade or even a defensive nade to keep yourself alive, as well as hitting that sleep dart to interrupt important rollouts. Next on the list is Zarya, and while she is a very interesting tank, she's not a very popular one right now, but if you do come across one in your games, just know that you want to pressure her out with burst damage in between her bubbles. Her bubbles are very strong defensive cooldowns, but she needs to be very deliberate about when she uses them, so you want to try and force her to use them and only punish her when she's not ready to use them. For tanks here, I'll recommend Winston into Zarya because you should have no problem jumping clean over the Zarya, ignoring her for most of the time, and then splitting her from her team using your bubble. You'll also be putting out AoE cleave damage, which is very hard to respond to as Zarya, who only has bubbles as the defensive cooldown. For DPS against Zarya, I'll recommend Widowmaker, since thanks to Widowmaker's range, you'll be able to stay safely away from anything Zarya can throw at you, including her ultimate Graviton Surge. And since Zarya's bubbles are best used reactively and you can't really react to your teammates dying to a headshot, Widowmaker basically has free reign over the entire battlefield when there's a Zarya on the enemy team. And finally, for the support line, I'm actually going to recommend Lifeweaver, our newest support, as a counter to Zarya. You can use your pedal platform to take high grounds around the enemy Zarya, effectively outranging her, and anytime she uses her Graviton Surge, both your pedal platform and your life grip can help allies escape the radius. I really didn't think I'd be recommending Lifeweaver in almost any situation right now, but against Zarya, he's definitely a strong pick. It feels like hero diversity is at an all-time high in Overwatch 2 right now, but it also feels like there's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors matchup when it comes to compositions and heroes, especially when it comes down to the tank line. I hope the advice in this video helps give you some direction about what sorts of picks or tactics you should employ against different tanks, and will hopefully help you find more victories this season. Anyway, that's all for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.